He found her floating in the wreckage of a battle, a warrior princess clinging to life in an escape pod. When Elias Vaughn opened the hatch, she put a knife to his throat. But what happened next shocked them both. Elias Vaughn guided the wayfarer's luck through a field of drifting metal and fractured hulls. Twisted spires of wrecked warships stretched for kilometers in every direction, their shattered forms illuminated by distant starlight that did little to warm the scene. His long-range sensors had pinged an hour earlier, a skirmish in neutral space, a merchant fleet caught between two rival factions. But by the time he arrived, the fighting was over. Only the aftermath remained. His console chimed. Not the low hum of passive scanners, but the sharp double beep of something specific. A survivor pod. He adjusted the view. Tucked between the flaming carcass of a frigate and the spinning debris of a supply ship, a smaller vessel hung in the void. It was intact. Oddly so, protocol said to leave it. Salvage law was vague out here, and survival pods often carried more trouble than they were worth. Refugees, deserters, disease. Sometimes even traps laid by pirates or privateers looking for easy prey. But something about this one felt different. He nudged the thrusters, bringing his freighter into a slow, cautious approach. The pod's design was alien. Sleek lines, bronze gold plating along the seams, markings that suggested rank or origin. Human pods were all sharp angles and standardized alloy. This was something else. An energy halo flickered around it. Not the soft glow of life support, but the fading pulse of recent weapons fire. Something had tried to breach it and failed. He rotated the ship, aligning the airlock. His own vessel wasn't much to look at. Patched plating, jury-rigged systems, the kind of ship that made port authorities nervous. But it had good clamps. Reliable. He extended the docking arm with a low, hydraulic hiss. The pod's surface was scored with micrometeorite, impacts and the telltale darkening of plasma. Burns. Recent, very recent. Battle damage. Whoever was inside had escaped something violent, and not long ago. He ran a final scan. One life sign. Faint, but steady. His hand hovered over the release for the docking clamps. Once he locked on, there was no turning back. The pod would be his responsibility. He could still pull away, find a quiet route to the nearest relay station, report the coordinates, let some salvage crew or military patrol deal with it. But curiosity had always been his weakness. He hit the engage switch. The clamps closed with a solid final thud. The sound echoed through the ship's frame. He was committed. The airlock hissed as pressure equalized. Elias stood ready with a med kit, expecting to find someone wounded, maybe unconscious. He'd seen escape pod survivors before, pale, shaken, grateful. Sometimes they didn't make it. He braced himself for the worst. The hatch slid open. A blur of motion erupted from the darkness. Not a stumble, not a crawl, a launch. A figure clad in close-fit armor, skin the color of burnished bronze, moved with a speed that bypassed thought and went straight to instinct. Before his brain registered the threat, cold metal pressed against his throat. Her eyes locked onto his. Not wide with fear, not soft with relief. They held the flat, assessing stare of a predator sizing up prey. Her body was coiled, balanced on the balls of her feet, every muscle taut. She held a blade with a curved edge, its point resting just above his carotid artery. One twitch and it would be over. This was Zalara, a Zari warrior, trained from childhood in combat survival. Her people valued strength, suspicion, and the assumption that every hand turned against you until proven otherwise. Rescue was just a different kind of trap, a softer approach. She scanned the corridor behind him, the shadows, the access panels. Her breathing was controlled, but he could see the strain in her neck, the slight tremble in her knife arm. She was hurt. Badly. Elias kept his hands visible. He didn't speak. Any sudden sound might be misinterpreted. Her gaze flickered from his face to the med kit in his hand, back to his eyes. She was calculating risk, need, opportunity. The silence stretched. The only sound was the hum of the ship's life support and their shared, shallow breathing. She was weighing his usefulness against the danger he represented. Her training screamed at her to neutralize the threat, secure the area, treat her own wounds, but the pain was a sharp, persistent counterpoint to doctrine. She needed help, and he was here, offering it. Finally, her jaw tightened. The knife didn't move from his throat, but her voice cut through the quiet, low and gritty with pain. "Med bay," she said. It wasn't a request. It was an order, a conditional acceptance of aid with the terms set by the blade still at his neck. The first contact was over. The negotiation had just begun. Elias led the way to the medical bay with his hands held clear of his sides. The knife stayed against his throat, a constant cold reminder of her distrust. He didn't look back, but he could feel her presence, a controlled, dangerous shadow matching his steps. The corridor felt longer than usual, each hatch and panel now a potential threat in her eyes. She scanned everything. The overhead lighting strips, the ventilation grates, the data ports. Her head turned in sharp, efficient movements. Nothing escaped her notice. It was a professional assessment, the kind you only see in soldiers or hunters. Her body was a contradiction, poised to strike yet undercut by a slight limp and the shallow pull of her breath. The ship's intercom crackled. A dry, synthesized voice filled the silence. "New acquisition, Captain. She's got style. And a blade, charming." It was V, the ship's AI. Elias ignored it. Zalara's eyes flicked upward, tracking the sound, but she didn't flinch. Her focus returned to Elias. The knife didn't waver. Inside the medbay, the white lights hummed to life. Sterile surfaces, cabinets of supplies, the central medbed with its array of sensors. He gestured toward it. She didn't move. Instead, she positioned herself near the door, keeping both him and the exit in sight. Pride was etched into the set of her jaw, but beneath it, weariness dragged at her eyelids. He powered up the diagnostic array. A soft blue light swept over her. She stiffened but held her ground. The screen beside him filled with data. Fractured ribs, dehydration, energy depletion, plasma burns along her left side, recently sealed but not healed, multiple contusions. She'd been through something brutal and hadn't stopped moving since. He prepped a regenerator, making each movement deliberate and visible. His fingers worked slowly, loading biogel into the applicator. Her eyes followed his hands, not with curiosity, with threat assessment. She was cataloging his actions, calculating response times, judging his intent. It was unnerving. He'd helped injured crew before. None had watched him like he might turn the med tools into weapons. The regenerator chimed, ready. He held it up, not offering, just showing. "This will help the tissue damage," he said. His voice was calm, neutral. She didn't answer. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the ship and the low whir of medical systems. Her shoulders were rigid. Then, almost imperceptibly, the tension in her knife arm eased. The blade lowered a fraction, not away, just down. Her eyes stayed locked on his. The defiance remained, but something else slipped through. A raw need. The pain was winning. Her lips parted. The words came out clipped, strained. "Fix me." It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't trust. It was surrender to necessity. The first real crack in the armor. Elias heated a packet of chicken soup in the small galley unit. The synthetic heating element hummed and steam rose from the container. He carried it back to the medbay where Zalara sat on the edge of the treatment table. Her posture was rigid, her eyes tracking his movements with the same intensity she'd shown since he'd found her. She'd accepted medical aid out of necessity. But food was different. Food was cultural, personal, dangerous. He set the bowl on a tray and pushed it toward her. The aroma filled the small space, salty, warm, unfamiliar. Her nostrils flared. Her expression didn't change, but her gaze dropped to the bowl. She didn't touch it. Her hands remained in her lap, fingers resting lightly, ready. Every line of her body communicated suspicion. Accepting sustenance from an outsider went against her training, her instincts, possibly even her honor code. To take food was to acknowledge dependence, to risk poison, manipulation, or worse. But her body needed fuel. The med scans showed severe caloric deficit. Her systems were running on emergency reserves. Pride was one thing. Survival was another. The conflict played out in the tightness around her eyes, the slight tightening of her lips. She was weighing the unknown substance in the bowl against the very real weakness in her limbs. After a long moment, she reached for the spoon. Her movement was slow, deliberate. Not hesitant, controlled. She lifted it, her eyes never leaving his face. She brought the spoon to her nostrils first, inhaling cautiously. Her brow furrowed slightly. It clearly didn't smell like anything from her world. She took a small taste. Just a sip of the broth. Her mouth closed. She held it on her tongue, her expression unreadable. The moment stretched. Elias waited. He'd seen species react violently to human food before. Allergies, disgust, even religious offense. She was a complete unknown, she swallowed. Her throat moved. Her posture didn't relax. She was still assessing, analyzing the aftertaste, monitoring her own body for any adverse reaction. Her free hand stayed near her side, within easy reach of a hidden weapon. She was tasting soup like it was a tactical puzzle. Then she took another spoonful, a larger one this time. She ate with the same efficient precision she did everything else. No wasted motion, no show of pleasure. But she ate. When the bowl was half empty, she set the spoon down. She looked at him, her golden eyes unblinking. "Not terrible," she said. Her voice was flat, but a faint, dry amusement touched the words. It was the first thing she'd said that wasn't a demand or an assessment of threat. It wasn't gratitude. It was an evaluation, a neutral, almost humorous concession, a tiny crack in the wall not of trust but of shared reality. They could at least agree on the passable quality of reconstituted chicken soup. It was a start. Zalara stood motionless near the cockpit doorway, her gaze sweeping across the control panels and readouts. Elias assumed she was just familiarizing herself with the layout, the way any new passenger might. The Wayfarer's luck was an old Mark IV freighter, its systems a mix of standard issue and aftermarket modifications. He'd owned it for 8 years. He knew its quirks, its rattles, the little fixes he kept meaning to get around to. He thought of it as reliable. Worn in, she took a single step forward. Her eyes stopped on the stabilizer status display. It showed a minor fluctuation, something he'd long ago accepted as normal. A background hum the ship had always had. She tilted her head slightly. "Your inertial dampeners are misaligned by 0.3 degrees, she said. Her voice was quiet, matter-of-fact. It wasn't a question. Elias turned in his chair. "It's within tolerance. It's always been like that." "It wastes 7% of your thrust efficiency," she replied, her eyes still on the screen, "and creates a harmonic vibration that will fatigue your starboard structural braces within another 2 standard years." She didn't look at him. She was already diagnosing the problem, her fingers tracing a phantom schematic in the air. The calibration was set for a full cargo load. "You run light." The system never recentered. He stared at her. How could she know that? The specs on a Mark IV weren't exactly proprietary, but the subtle interplay between mass distribution and stabilizer alignment wasn't common knowledge. It was the kind of thing only a seasoned engineer or a pilot who'd lived inside a ship's systems for decades would notice, and she'd spotted it in under a minute. A strange feeling settled in his gut. Part admiration, part unease. Her knowledge wasn't theoretical. It was practical, immediate. She understood the machine on a level he didn't. Before he could form a response, she was moving. She stepped past him to an access panel beside the co-pilot's station. It housed secondary navigation relays. He'd never had cause to open it. She didn't ask permission. Her fingers found the release catch, a latch he didn't even know was there, and the panel swung open. Inside was a nest of fiber optic lines and processing nodes. She reached in, her movements precise and unhesitating. She didn't consult a manual. She didn't second-guess. She simply identified a specific coupler, gave it a quarter-turn counterclockwise, and reseated a connection node. She closed the panel. The low, almost imperceptible hum that had been a constant presence on the ship since he'd bought it simply vanished. The stabilizer readout on his screen smoothed into a perfect, steady line. The silence felt profound. He looked from the screen to her. She was wiping a trace of dust from her fingers, her expression neutral. She had just fixed something he'd lived with for years without a single tool, without breaking a sweat. It was a demonstration, not of superiority but of capability. She wasn't just a warrior who happened to be on a ship. She was a part of it, an asset. The dynamic between them shifted in that silent moment. She was no longer a passenger. She was crew. Elias cycled the airlock and the outer hatch slid open, revealing the star-speckled blackness. He'd done this 100 times, but for Zalara, he ran through the basics. Magnetic boots, safety tether, comms check. He expected her to need the guidance. Eva was a specialized skill, a dangerous ballet that took humans years to master without panic. She listened, her expression unreadable behind her faceplate. Then she stepped out onto the hull. There was no hesitation, no careful testing of the magnetic soles. She simply moved. Her personal atmosphere shield, a shimmering, barely visible field that clung to her form like a second skin, adjusted without a flicker. It wasn't bulky suit tech. It was an extension of her. She walked across the metal plating as if she were on a solid deck, not perched on a speck of life hurtling through a vacuum that would kill her in seconds. Elias followed, his own movements careful, deliberate. His boots clanked with each step locking and unlocking. Her feet made no sound. She moved with a fluid, weightless grace, her balance perfect. She didn't fight the void. She used it. A slight push from a handhold sent her gliding to the next position, her body rotating with an instinctive control that was unnerving to watch. He realized, with a slow dawning unease, that he had fundamentally misread her. He'd seen a warrior, a survivor. He hadn't considered her environment. For humans, space was a hostile frontier to be conquered with thick hulls and complex machinery, a place we visited. For her, it seemed this was home. Her ease was born of a lifetime spent in microgravity, of a biology and culture that had evolved with the stars as a constant. The way she stood, utterly relaxed on the surface of the ship, made his own cautious posture feel clumsy and primitive. He was a visitor here. She was a native. Her eyes, sharp even through the faceplate, scanned the ship's superstructure. She wasn't just looking. She was reading the hull like a map. She pointed a gloved hand toward a cluster of sensor arrays near the communications dish. "There," she said, her voice clear over the comm. "Micrometeorite strike. The housing is compromised. Your long-range scans will have a 15% degradation in resolution." "You didn't notice?" He hadn't. It was a small thing hidden behind a support strut, easily missed unless you knew exactly where to look and what to look for. She had spotted it from 30 meters away while moving in vacuum. It wasn't just technical knowledge. It was a spatial awareness, a familiarity with the fragility of machines in the deep black that he could never fully possess. The realization settled over him, cold and silent as the space around them. He hadn't rescued some castaway from a battle. He had pulled a deep space predator into his ship. She wasn't a passenger finding her footing. She was in her element and he was the one out of place. The dynamic he thought he understood inverted itself completely. He was the land creature she was temporarily tolerating on her ocean. The rescue narrative evaporated, replaced by something far more complex and unsettling. She belonged to the void in a way he never could. Zalara paused in the doorway of the ship's small gym, her eyes moving over the solitary weight bench and the set of adjustable dumbbells. Her expression was flat, unreadable, but Elias caught the slight tilt of her head, a silent judgment. He felt a defensive twinge. The setup was basic, utilitarian, but it worked. He'd kept himself in shape with it for years. It was human grade, adequate. She stepped into the room and circled the bench. Her fingers brushed the main support beam, tracing a weld seam near the base. She made a soft, dismissive sound in her throat. Then, without warning, her hands closed around the uprights. There was no strain on her face, no tightening of her shoulders. She simply exerted force. Metal groaned in protest, then shrieked as she tore the bolted assembly apart with her bare hands. Elias took a step back. The sound was visceral, unnatural. The bench wasn't flimsy. It was solid steel rated for heavy loads. She dismantled it with brutal, efficient motions, pulling rivets from their housings, bending support rods like they were wire. Her strength wasn't just beyond human. It was in a different category altogether. This wasn't about leverage or technique. It was raw, applied power. The pieces lay scattered on the deck plating. She knelt, sorting through them with a critical eye. Her disdain made sense now. It wasn't for the act of training. It was for the poor quality of the tool. She began reassembling it, but not as it was. She realigned the main frame, creating a wider, more stable base. She used a handful of spare bolts from a nearby maintenance kit, her fingers working with the precise certainty of a master engineer. She didn't hammer or weld. She applied pressure at exact points, reshaping the metal, forcing new threads into old holes with her fingertips. Elias watched, his earlier defensiveness replaced by a grudging, awed respect. This was craftsmanship. She wasn't just breaking something. She was making it better, stronger. The reconstructed bench looked more like a piece of ship's architecture than exercise equipment. Every joint was reinforced, every angle optimized for stress distribution. It was a piece of engineering, not a store-bought gadget. She stood back, wiping a smudge of grease from her hand onto her thigh. Her breathing was even. The effort hadn't winded her. She looked at him, her golden eyes holding his. "Strength is not a hobby for my people," she said. Her voice was matter-of-fact, devoid of boasting. "It is essential. The first lesson, a weak body is a vulnerable mind. A vulnerable mind is a dead warrior." She gestured to the bench. It now looked like it could support the weight of a small vehicle. "This will do." For now, the statement hung in the air. It was an approval, but a conditional one. It was also a statement of principle. Her presence on his ship wasn't incidental. Her skills, her physicality, they were core to her being. She had just demonstrated that she could break his world apart and put it back together. Improved. The flimsy human bench, now solid and formidable, stood between them as a new kind of artifact. It was no longer just his, it was theirs, a shared object redesigned by her hands for their use. The partnership was no longer just about navigation or survival. It was physical, practical, rebuilt from the bolts up. The ship's AI, designated V, observed everything. Its voice usually emanated from the overhead speakers with a dry, synthetic cadence that Elias had long grown accustomed to. V's commentary ranged from navigational updates to sarcastic observations about his life choices. It was part of the ship's fabric, a constant, slightly judgmental presence. This time, however, V's focus was new. Biological signature confirmed, the AI stated, its tone clinically flat. Species designation, Zari. Fascinating. Their muscle density averages 40% above human baseline. Neural conductivity is also significantly enhanced. They process threat assessments in approximately half the time you do, Captain. A notable upgrade from your last acquisition. The word acquisition was delivered with a particular synthetic weight. Elias winced. V had a long memory for his mistakes. "I don't collect things, V," Elias muttered, tightening a bolt on the comms panel a little harder than necessary. "Historical data suggests otherwise," V replied promptly. "There was the allegedly tame Vexian moss spore that dissolved 2 bulkheads. The harmless energy crystal that rerouted primary power to the waste reclamation unit for 3 days. And let's not forget the—" "I get it," Elias cut in. Zalara, who had been silently observing a diagnostic screen, turned her head slightly. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. It was the first truly expressive reaction Elias had seen from her that wasn't rooted in threat or pain. She seemed amused. The idea that a machine would taunt its operator clearly entertained her. Her culture probably didn't have AIs with personality matrices, or if they did, they were likely more respectful. V, sensing a new audience, continued. "My scans indicate your cellular regeneration is operating at an accelerated rate. Impressive. A human would still be confined to a medbed. You are currently operating at 82% of your standard capacity. I calculate you will achieve full physical readiness within 47 hours. The AI paused. "Shall I update the ship's manifest to list you as cargo hazardous or crew temp?" Elias sighed. "Neither, V. Just run a diagnostic on the thrust array." But the dynamic had already shifted. V's commentary, usually a one-sided exchange of barbs directed at Elias, now had a second participant, even if she wasn't verbally engaging. Zalara's silent amusement was a response in itself. The AI's sensors provided a stream of data about her that was objective, detached, and utterly fascinated. It was analyzing her not as a person, but as a fascinating biological system, a puzzle to be decoded. This created an unexpected triangular relationship. Elias, the human, grounded in his own limitations and emotions. Zalara, the alien, a creature of physical precision and ingrained suspicion. And V, the machine, a disembodied intelligence observing them both with clinical interest and dry humor. They weren't a team, not yet, but they were no longer just a rescuer and his rescue. The AI, in its own strange way, was becoming a neutral ground, a translator of sorts between two very different beings. It spoke the language of data to both of them, and in doing so, built a bridge made of facts, observations, and sarcastic asides. The tension of their standoff began to soften around the edges, eroded not by trust but by the shared, slightly ridiculous experience of being analyzed by a smart-mouthed ship's computer. Raska 9 hung in the viewport, a mottled brown and gray sphere wreathed in the faint glimmer of orbital traffic. It was the closest thing to a supply hub in this sector, which meant it was a half-lawless mess where you could buy anything from illegal ship modifications to a questionable cup of coffee that somehow cost more than engine fuel. Elias finished running the standard approach checks. They needed fuel cells, water filters, and information. Mostly information. Someone out there had tried to kill Zalara. He intended to find out who, He turned to her. She stood near the co-pilot station, her gaze fixed on the planet below. "I'll handle this solo," he said. "You should stay aboard. Lock the ship down. It's safer," he meant it. Ports like Raska 9 were nests of opportunists and informants. An alien of her distinctive appearance would be a beacon for every bounty hunter and slaver on the rock. She didn't look at him. Her eyes continued to trace the shipping lanes and docking patterns on the screen. "No," she said. The word was flat, final. "I will accompany you." "It's not a good idea," he countered, keeping his voice level. Look, it draws eyes, the wrong kind." Finally, she turned. Her expression was that familiar, unreadable mask of assessment. "My look is not the liability you believe it to be. My skills are. I sense the corruption in that place from here. You plan to walk into it alone, armed with what? A sidearm you rarely draw? My combat efficiency is superior to any weapon on this vessel." She stated it as a simple fact, like noting the temperature. There was no arrogance. Just certainty. He saw the logic. He'd seen her move. He'd felt the strength in her hands. But logic warred with a deeper, ingrained caution. His risk assessment was about avoiding notice, blending in. Hers was about overwhelming any threat that noticed them. They were two completely different philosophies of survival, clashing in the quiet of the cockpit. "They'll see you coming a kilometer away," he argued. A last attempt at reason. "Let them," she replied. Her tone didn't change. "It is better to be seen and prepared than to be blind and vulnerable. You have no operational awareness of the ground threat. I do. I am your protection, whether you acknowledge the need for it or not." The debate was over. He could order her to stay. He was the captain. But he knew with a sinking feeling that it wouldn't matter. She would follow. Or she would go anyway. Her concept of chain of command was clearly negotiable at best. Arguing further was just wasted oxygen. He conceded with a slow exhale, the decision sitting heavily in his gut. It was against every instinct, every protocol he'd ever followed. He banked the ship toward the designated public landing bay. The freighter shuddered as it hit the upper atmosphere. Below, the sprawling neon-lit chaos of the main trade port came into sharp focus. He could already feel the eyes. They were no longer a lone scavenger and his secret passenger. They were a pair. A human freighter captain and a bronze-skinned Zari warrior, descending into the marketplace together. An uneasy, conspicuous team. The crowded streets of Raska 9's main market swallowed them whole. Neon signs flashed advertisements for dubious engine mods and questionable medical services, their light reflecting off damp pavement and the hooded faces of a dozen different species. The air smelled of ozone, frying grease, and the sharp, coppery scent of industrial runoff. Elias kept his head down, moving with the practiced aimlessness of someone who didn't want to be remembered. It was a skill honed over years of visiting places where attention was a currency you didn't want to spend. Beside him, Zalara walked. She did not try to blend in. Her posture was erect, her head held high, her eyes continuously scanning the crowd, the rooftops, the shadowed alleys between prefab stalls. Her long, tapered ears, distinct against the sharp lines of her jaw, twitched at the cacophony of shouted prices and haggling cries. Her bronze skin seemed to catch the garish neon light and amplify it, making her glow like a polished statue moving through a sea of drab colors. They were noticed immediately. Elias felt it like a physical pressure, the weight of dozens of eyes shifting from their wares or their conversations to track their passage. A vendor selling thermal coils froze mid-spiel, his three-fingered hand pausing over his display. A group of hulking laborers in dust-stained coveralls fell silent as she passed, their conversation dying in their throats. The market's chaotic rhythm hit a series of tiny, staggered pauses in their wake. Some of the stares were merely curious. Wide-eyed stares from species who had perhaps never seen a Zari before, taking in her athletic build and unusual pigmentation. But many more were wary. Hard-eyed merchants subtly moved valuable items further back on their counters. A few patrons took a deliberate step back, creating a small unconscious circle of empty space around her. Fear was a common language here, and she spoke it fluently without saying a word. Elias's own sense of vulnerability spiked. He was used to being anonymous. Now he was the human attached to the alien spectacle. Every stare directed at her felt like a stare directed at him. His hand itched to rest on the grip of his own sidearm, a nervous habit he had to consciously suppress. Drawing a weapon here would only escalate the tension she was generating by merely existing. Zalara seemed utterly unaffected. Her scan of the environment was methodical, professional. She noted the wary merchant, the edgy laborers, the narrow escape routes between stalls. Her right hand rested casually at her side, but her fingers were loose, her wrist cocked at an angle that would allow her to draw the combat knife from her thigh sheath in a fraction of a second. She wasn't nervous. She was working. They moved through the market not as two people trying to be invisible, but as a single, conspicuous unit. A human trying to fade into the background, and a warrior who was the background's most interesting feature. Any hope of a quiet, anonymous supply run evaporated in the neon haze. They were a performance now, and every merchant they approached would be part of the audience. The fuel regulator lay on the counter between them, a dull gray cylinder pitted with age and flecked with carbon scoring. The merchant, a thin man with oil-stained hands and a shifty gaze, named a price that was already too high. Elias began the dance. He pointed out the wear on the intake valve, the substandard alloy of the housing, the lack of a manufacturer's stamp. He spoke in technical terms, pulling the conversation back to the object itself, to the facts of its condition and its actual worth. It was a tactic that usually worked. Establish a shared reality based on the thing being sold, not the people selling it. But the merchant's eyes kept sliding past him. They fixed on Zalara, who stood a few paces back, her arms crossed, her expression a mask of neutral observation. The merchant's attention wasn't curious. It was wary, calculating. He was reassessing the entire situation based on her presence. "Zari, huh?" he said, interrupting Elias's critique of the flow rate sensor. The question hung in the air, invasive and loaded. It wasn't a greeting. It was a probe. Elias tried to deflect. The regulator. Let's focus on the regulator. The coupling here looks like it's been remachined. He tapped the component, trying to ground the merchant in the tangible. But the man was already somewhere else. He was looking at Zalara like she was an unexploded grenade that had rolled into his shop. His posture had changed. He was leaning back slightly, putting more counter between them. His fingers, which had been resting on the part, now drummed a nervous rhythm on the scratched surface. Zalara said nothing. Her silence was absolute. She didn't confirm or deny her species. She didn't react to the merchant's stare. She just watched. Her stillness was more unnerving than any movement could have been. It forced the merchant to project his own fears onto her. He was negotiating with a phantom threat, and it was making him reckless. The merchant's eyes flicked back to Elias. The nervous assessment was complete. He had decided they were desperate. A human and a Zari together, needing a specific part for an aging ship. His smile was thin, devoid of warmth. "New price," he said. He named a figure that was triple his opening offer. It was an obscene amount. A predator's price, smelling blood in the water. Supply and demand. You understand? Elias felt the control of the negotiation evaporate. The technical details, the fair market value, none of it mattered anymore. The conversation was no longer about a machine part. It was about power, fear, and opportunity. The merchant saw vulnerability and was driving a spike into it. Elias opened his mouth to protest, to walk away, but he knew he needed that part. The wayfarer's luck wouldn't make another jump without it. The merchant knew it too. The situation was slipping through his fingers. Then Zalara moved. She didn't step forward aggressively. She simply uncrossed her arms and took one smooth, silent step to the side, bringing herself fully into the merchant's sightline. He flinched, his eyes widening. She looked from his face to the regulator on the counter, then back to him. Her voice, when she spoke, was flat, calm, and carried the weight of absolute certainty. It was a single word, delivered not as a question but as a statement of fact that brooked no argument. No. The scent of sizzling meat and spices cut through the market's industrial haze. A small stall run by a grizzled man with cybernetic arms sold skewers of some local beast, charred over an open flame. Zalara stopped, her attention caught by the simple primal process. Elias watched her. He expected the same rejection he'd seen with the soup, the ingrained suspicion, the cultural programming that screamed not to trust outsider offerings. Food was intimate, dangerous. The vendor noticed her too. His eyes, set in a web of wrinkles, tracked over her distinct features, the bronze skin, the sharp ears. His hands, one flesh and one polished metal, stilled their work for a fraction of a second. It was a look Elias had seen all day, a mix of curiosity and deep-seated wariness. The vendor's gaze wasn't hostile, but it was assessing. He saw Azari, and that came with a whole set of assumptions. "You actually gonna eat that?" the vendor asked her directly. His voice was rough, scratched from years of shouting over market noise. The question hung in the air. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine, wary curiosity laced with a challenge. Would the alien warrior actually consume his food? It was a micro-test of cross-cultural acceptance, and the outcome was uncertain. It could easily tilt toward offense or misunderstanding. Elias tensed, ready to step in. To deflect, to order something for himself, to break the tension, to explain. A single wrong word, a misinterpreted tone, and the simple act of buying food could spiral. Zalara's hand rested near her weapon, her body a coiled spring of potential reaction. The vendor watched her, his expression unreadable. She didn't look at Elias. Her focus remained on the skewer. After a measured pause, she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The vendor, without another word, handed one over. She took it, her grip careful and deliberate. She didn't immediately bite into it. She raised it to her nose, inhaling the scent of seared meat and unfamiliar spices. Her eyes were analytical, dissecting the aroma like a chemical compound. Then she took a bite, not a large one. A small, controlled sampling. She chewed slowly, her expression neutral, her gaze distant as she focused on the sensory data. It was a ritual, a methodical evaluation. She was testing the texture, the flavor profile, the aftertaste, scanning her own body for any adverse reaction. It was the opposite of a hungry person eating. It was a scientist conducting an experiment on herself. Elias held his breath. The vendor watched, his cybernetic arm whirring softly as he crossed his arms. The moment stretched, filled by the market's din. Zalara swallowed. Her eyes met the vendor's. Her face gave nothing away. Then that same dry, flat tone from the medbay. "Not terrible," she stated. The tension snapped. The vendor's stern expression broke into a grudging, surprised grin. He gave a short, sharp laugh and turned back to his grill. Elias let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It was the same verdict she'd given the soup. Not praise, not acceptance, but a neutral, slightly humorous acknowledgement of adequacy. It was her version of a peace offering, delivered with the same deadpan practicality she used for everything. She had navigated the moment on her own terms, turning a potential point of conflict into a tiny, shared understanding. She took another, more confident bite. The market crowd ahead of them began to part, not with the usual jostling flow of shoppers, but with a ripple of unease. A group of 5 figures moved against the current, their progress deliberate and unimpeded. They wore mismatched armor, patched and scarred from use, but their weapons were uniform. Well-maintained plasma rifles held loosely at their sides. Their insignia was a splash of red on their shoulder plates, a stylized claw mark. Elias's stomach tightened. He knew that mark. The red talons. They had a reputation, and it wasn't for charitable work. He hoped for a desperate second that they were just passing through, headed for some other target, some other transaction in this den of questionable commerce. But their course didn't waver. They walked straight toward him and Zalara. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a network of old scars across his face, locked eyes not on Elias but on the woman beside him. His gaze dropped to the small, intricate insignia etched into the pauldron of her armor, a geometric pattern in bronze gold that Elias had barely noticed before. The mercenary's eyes widened a fraction. He knew it. He recognized her people. The Red Talons were professional hunters. They tracked bounties, and they were very good at ensuring their targets didn't escape. The rifles came up. Not aimed, not yet, but the muzzles were no longer pointing at the ground. They were held at the ready, fingers resting near triggers. The market's noise seemed to fade around their little island of impending violence. Patrons and vendors alike took several steps back, clearing a wide circle. No one wanted to be caught in the crossfire of a Talon operation. Elias's mind raced. Negotiation, de-escalation. It was the only tool he had. His own sidearm felt woefully inadequate against their firepower. He raised his hands, palms out, a universal sign of non-aggression. "Whatever the problem is, we can talk," he said, his voice calm but carrying over the sudden quiet. "There's no need for this. I'm sure we can come to an arrangement. Credits can be transferred, right now." He was trying to speak their language, the language of profit and transaction. The Talon leader's mouth curved into a smile. It was a cold, thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of a predator who already has his prey cornered. He glanced at Elias with a flicker of dismissive amusement. Then his attention returned to Zalara. He was assessing her, his head cocked to the side as if examining a prize animal. Beside Elias, Zalara moved. It wasn't a large movement. She didn't flinch or step back. Her weight simply shifted, her knees bending slightly, her shoulders dropping into a lower, more balanced stance. Her hands, which had been relaxed at her sides, were now open and held away from her body. Ready, her entire being focused into a state of pure, predatory readiness. The change was instantaneous and absolute. The quiet observer was gone, replaced by the warrior. The air around them grew thick with the promise of violence. The mercenary leader's cold smile widened. He'd seen her reaction. He approved of it. It confirmed her value. He took a half step forward, his voice a low, gravelly thing meant only for them. "No arrangement," he said. The words were final. The client was very specific. They want her alive. The price on this one's head is too good to pass up. A plasma bolt sizzled past Elias's ear, close enough that he felt the heat ripple across his cheek. The air crackled with the ozone stink of a near miss. He didn't think. He dropped, his shoulder hitting the grimy pavement as he rolled behind a stall selling engine parts. Hard metal components dug into his back. The merchant was already gone, vanished into the rising chaos. Around him, the market erupted. Screams. The crash of overturned stalls. The panicked scramble of a crowd that wanted no part of this. Zalara did not drop. She moved. As the first mercenary lunged for her, rifle raised to strike, she sidestepped the blow with an economy of motion that was chilling. Her hand shot out not to block, but to grasp. Her fingers closed around his forearm. There was a sharp, sickening crack of bone and polymer armor giving way under pressure a human couldn't generate. The man's roar of pain was cut short as she used his own momentum to hurl him into a stack of supply crates. He hit with a crash and did not get up. It was not a brawl. It was a dismantling. Her style was brutally efficient, every movement serving a purpose. A second attacker fired. She was already twisting, the plasma shot scorching the air where her head had been. She closed the distance before he could fire again. A hard, precise strike to his throat with the edge of her hand dropped him, choking to his knees. A third came at her from the side. She didn't even turn her head. Her elbow snapped back into his ribs. The sound was a wet thud. He folded. "Zalara, fall back." Elias shouted from his cover, his voice straining over the din. "We need to go, now." His own pistol was in his hand, but he had no clear shot, no angle that wouldn't risk hitting her or a fleeing civilian. His strategy was evasion, a fighting retreat to the ship. Hers was annihilation. She ignored him completely, a force of nature operating on a different set of rules. 2 more Talons were down in as many seconds, their weapons clattering to the ground beside their unconscious forms. The marketplace was pure bedlam. Panicked shoppers and vendors fled in every direction, creating a chaotic tide of bodies. Stalls were overturned, their contents spilling across the walkways. The neon signs cast frantic, jumping shadows over the scene. The initial circle of spectators had dissolved into a stampede. It was cover and obstacle all at once. Zalara paused for a half-second, her chest rising and falling in a steady, controlled rhythm. Her eyes scanned the surging crowd, the layout of the stalls, the angles of fire. She wasn't just fighting. She was calculating. She saw a path Elias could not. With a final, dismissive glance at the remaining mercenaries who were hesitating, regrouping, she turned. She grabbed a heavy crate from a nearby overturned stall and hurled it through the front window of a cantina. The explosion of glass and the resulting shouts created a new focal point of chaos, drawing attention away from them. She looked back at Elias, her gaze locking onto his position. She didn't shout or gesture wildly. She simply nodded toward a narrow alley between 2 prefab structures, a route that had been blocked by crowd pressure moments before. Her violent, precise work had cleared a pocket of calm. She had not retreated. She had created an exit. The opening was there. Elias shoved through the panicked crowd, his shoulder connecting with a fleeing merchant. The air was thick with screams and the acrid smell of burnt circuitry from a damaged stall. He focused on the landing bay ahead, a gap in the chaotic tapestry of the market. His ship was there. Safety. He didn't look back, trusting Zalara was behind him. The sound of plasma fire and the sharp crack of bone told him she was busy. He risked a glance over his shoulder. Two red talons had broken through the fleeing mass, their rifles coming up. Before they could aim, a heavy metal serving tray from a food stall spun through the air, thrown with impossible force. It struck the lead mercenary in the helmet, sending him stumbling. Solara moved in the periphery, a blur of controlled motion. She wasn't just running. She was managing the pursuit, using the environment as her arsenal. A stack of crates became a barrier. A vendor's cart was overturned to block an alley. She wasn't just covering their retreat. She was actively reshaping the battlefield to slow their enemies. A shot rang out closer this time. The heat of a plasma bolt seared past his arm. He ducked, expecting the impact. It didn't come. He turned. Solara had interposed herself between him and the shooter, her body a shield. Her left shoulder jerked. The fabric of her armor blackened and smoked where the grazing shot had caught her. She didn't cry out. She didn't even break stride. Her right hand came up, hurling a heavy spanner she'd snatched from a tool seller's table. It struck the shooter's weapon, knocking it from his grip. Her expression was fixed, a mask of pure focus. The pain was an irrelevance. A new understanding crashed over Elias as he ran. He thought he was leading her to safety. He was the captain. This was his world, his port. But in the heat of the escape, the roles had inverted. She wasn't following him. She was protecting him. Her defensive moves, her use of debris, her positioning, it was all calculated to keep the threat focused on her and away from him. She was the warrior. He was the asset to be extracted. The partnership he'd thought was based on mutual need now felt like something else. A duty, a choice she was making. They burst into the relative open space of the landing bay. The Wayfarer's luck sat 50 meters away, its ramp still lowered. The sound of shouting and bootsteps echoed from the market entrance behind them. The remaining Talons were closing the distance, using the cleared path their own panic had created. Elias sprinted for the ramp, his lungs burning. He hit the control to retract it the second his boots left the pavement. The hydraulics whined, the heavy metal plate rising. Solara was a step behind him. She turned at the base of the ramp, putting her back to the ship, facing their pursuers one last time. She stood there, a lone figure against the closing gap, her stance wide, her injured shoulder held tight. A final silent challenge. The ramp sealed with a solid thud and the hiss of pressurization. The roar of the market and the shouts of the mercenaries were cut off, replaced by the familiar hum of the ship's systems. They were in. They had made it. But the silence inside the ship was louder than the chaos outside. They stood in the airlock, breathing hard, the reality of the last few seconds settling between them. The escape was over. The implications were just beginning. The ship leapt away from Raska 9, the engine straining at maximum thrust. The G-force pressed Elias back into his seat, the planet shrinking rapidly in the rear display. The immediate roar of pursuit faded, replaced by the familiar, anxious hum of the Wayfarer's luck pushing its limits. He unbuckled his harness, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline dump. He expected anger, a critique of his failed negotiation, his poor planning, the entire botched mission. He was preparing his own defenses, his own apologies for drawing them into that firefight. Solara was already moving. She ignored the smoldering tear in her own armor where the plasma shot had grazed her. Instead, she stepped in front of him. Her hands came up, not in threat but with a clinical purpose. She tilted his head to the side, her fingers probing gently along his temple where a stray piece of debris had cut him. Her touch was unexpected, precise. The pressure was firm but careful, assessing the shallow wound with a detached expertise. She then checked his arms, turning his wrists to look for other minor injuries, her movements efficient and sure. He started to protest, to point to her own injury, but the words died in his throat. He watched her face. The warrior's mask was still there, the focused intensity, but it was now directed at a task of care, not combat. She retrieved the med kit from its wall locker. Her hands, which had moments ago been breaking bones and hurling mercenaries, now worked with a surgeon's delicacy. She cleaned the cut on his head with an antiseptic swab, the motion swift and gentle. She applied a dermal regenerator, setting the pulse to a low, soothing frequency. There was no hesitation, no fumbling. This was a practiced routine. A cold realization washed over him as he sat there, passive under her ministrations. She could have escaped alone. Easily. The chaos of the market was her element. She was faster, stronger, and far more capable in a fight than he could ever be. She could have vanished into the back alleys, found another ship, another way off that rock. The red talons were there for her, not him. Staying with him, protecting him had been a choice, a deliberate decision that increased her risk exponentially. She had interposed her body between him and their attackers. She had managed the entire retreat not just for herself but for him. He finally found his voice. "Why?" The word came out rough. "You could have gotten away clean back there. Why didn't you?" She finished sealing the tiny wound on his temple. Her golden eyes met his, holding his gaze for a long moment. The clinical focus softened by a fraction. She had just demonstrated a facet of her training he hadn't seen before, a warrior's medicine, the knowledge that survival sometimes meant patching up your allies. She looked at him, and for the first time the assessment in her eyes wasn't about threat levels or tactical advantages. It was something quieter. "You are different," she said. Her voice was low, the same flat tone she used for everything, but the words landed with a strange weight. It wasn't an explanation. It was a fact. A simple, profound statement that closed the conversation and opened a dozen others. She turned away then, finally attending to her own injured shoulder, leaving him with the echo of those 3 words and the lingering, gentle touch of her hands. The Wayfarer's luck hung in the quiet void, the immediate threat of Rosca 9 receding into a faint star behind them. Systems were stable. Injuries were minor. The only immediate problem was the one glowing on the main nav screen, a blinking cursor awaiting coordinates. The question of where next filled the cockpit, a silent wait between its 2 occupants. Elias naturally assumed her destination. Her people. The Zari. It was the logical choice. A warrior separated from her command, hunted by mercenaries. Her priority would be regrouping, reporting, returning to the safety of her own fleet or a known outpost. He began pulling up star charts for the sectors rumored to hold Zari space. He pointed to a cluster of systems on the edge of the main trade corridors. This general area is where long-range scans sometimes pick up their energy signatures. We could plot a course, send a coded hail, see if we get a response. He expected her to lean in, to refine the search, to guide him toward a specific point of safety. Zelara barely glanced at the screen. Her lack of interest was palpable, a quiet rejection of the entire premise. Instead, her focus shifted to another part of the chart, her fingers moving across the console with a familiarity that surprised him. She bypassed his search parameters entirely, calling up a different dataset, deeper scans, gravitational wave mappings, the kind of raw astrometric data he rarely had cause to examine. Her knowledge of navigation interfaces, of the underlying architecture of space itself, was disarming. She operated the system like it was her native language. Her hand stopped. A single finger tapped the screen, her nail clicking against the hardened glass. The point she indicated was not on the edge of known space. It was well beyond it, a patch of emptiness marked only by the alphanumeric designation of a long-range probe that had passed through a century ago. The data was sparse, unreliable. The region was a blank spot on every commercial and military chart he'd ever seen. It was the kind of place freighters avoided and exploration corps labeled potentially hazardous. Elias stared at the point of nothingness. "There's nothing there," he said, a statement of fact. No beacons, no surveyed routes, no mass shadows to even suggest a system. The gravitational lensing is chaotic. It's a navigational dead zone. We'd be flying blind. He looked from the screen to her. "Why there?" She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on that empty sector, her expression unreadable but intense. It wasn't the look of someone choosing a random destination. It was the look of someone drawn by a deep personal pull, a memory, an instinct, a whisper on a frequency only she could hear. She seemed connected to that void in a way he couldn't comprehend. The mystery of her past, the reason she was in that escape pod, it all seemed to point toward that emptiness. The silence stretched. The ship hummed. He waited for an explanation, a reason to risk everything on a leap into absolute unknown. He got none. Finally, she turned her head. Her golden eyes met his, holding his questioning gaze. The intensity softened by a fraction. A slight, almost imperceptible shrug lifted her shoulders. Her voice, when it came, was its usual flat calm, but it carried a new, unsettling weight. "Surprise me," she said. Alone in the cockpit, Elias let the silence settle around him. He played the events since the debris field back in his mind. He had pulled an escape pod from a graveyard of warships, expecting to find someone needing rescue. A victim. That had been the fundamental miscalculation. From the moment the hatch hissed open and a knife pressed to his throat, the script had flipped. He wasn't the rescuer. He was the one who had been found. She had done the rescuing since. On Raska 9, he'd been the one shielded from blaster fire, the one whose retreat was covered with brutal, efficient violence. She had faced down trained mercenaries for him. His ship, the Wayfarer's Luck, was in better shape now than when he'd found her. The stabilizers hummed with a perfect silent efficiency he'd never known. The weight bench in the gym was a rebuilt monument to her strength and practicality. She had fixed the things he'd learned to live with, and in doing so, had fixed something in his life. Before her, his purpose was simple: stay quiet, stay under the radar, survive, haul cargo, avoid trouble. Now he was charting a course into an uncharted sector on the word of an alien warrior. He had stood in a firefight in a crowded marketplace, a place he would have abandoned at the first sign of trouble just weeks ago. The dangers he was now facing were the very ones his entire adult life had been structured to evade. The risks were astronomical. The potential for violent death had skyrocketed, and yet he felt more alive than he had in years. The constant, low-grade hum of boredom that had been the soundtrack of his existence was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused clarity. Every sense felt heightened. The ship's systems, the star charts, the taste of synth coffee, it all held a new weight, a new significance. His life had gained a texture it had been missing. It had a point, a direction other than mere endurance. From the co-pilot's seat, Zalara watched him. Her gaze was its usual unreadable calm, but it felt different now. It was no longer the assessing stare of a prisoner evaluating her captor. It was the look of a partner waiting. Her silent presence was no longer a threat. It was an anchor. She had dismantled his old life not out of malice, but simply by being herself, by demanding a better standard, a higher level of engagement with the universe. The final assessment formed in his mind, clear and undeniable. The rational part of him, the part that valued safety and routine, screamed that this was madness, that he should drop her at the nearest civilized port and return to his quiet, predictable roots. But that life felt like a faded photograph now, dull and distant. Against all odds, against every shred of reason and self-preservation he possessed, his life had finally, undeniably, become interesting. The quiet was over. The real journey was just beginning. He pulled her from the wreckage, believing he was the savior. She saw him as just another variable in a hostile equation, but the rescue reversed itself in the quiet hum of the ship. Her hands, which held a blade to his throat, later mended his wounds and his machinery. His gentle care eroded her ingrained suspicion. From mutual need grew an unspoken reliance, a partnership forged across the vast divide of biology and culture. The universe expands when we let the unexpected in. Sometimes the person you save ends up saving you right back, changing everything.